Good morning and welcome to the Foggy Dew. This is Colin. Well, gang, we're back at it. And I guess before I dive into any of this, I just wanted to go ahead and thank the audience. I've gotten so much good feedback from the audience. I've gotten a bunch of great stories that I can kind of dig into. But all the feedback I get via text, email, whatever it is, all of your feedback makes this a better product. And again, I do this, partially I do this as kind of like a therapy. Like I have all these thoughts running around in my brain and it's helpful for me to go ahead and kind of articulate them. But I think people really like the content of the show and how it's presented. So anyway, I didn't go to podcast school, right? So this is all new to me. But I just really appreciate the engagement and everybody being so supportive. So thank you for all that. But I guess to dive into the content of the show, I had a couple quick hits, and I promise, right? Just a couple quick hits before I get into the main content. But I guess to go ahead and start off, the first topic is I have some wonderful news for you. And to be fair, I always like to start the show like on a positive note. And I saw this over the weekend, and it really made me happy. And what the news is that I guess Tony Fauchi needs help. Now he doesn't need your help wearing a mask, taking your booster, destroying your child's mind. What he needs help with, he needs help to pay his legal bills. You heard that correctly. Anthony Fauci needs help paying his legal bills, and that's just delightful news. So apparently now lawyers for Tony Fauci have set up a legal defense fund for this man. And I guess my first comment is it couldn't happen to a better guy. The fund itself is called the Anthony S. Fauci Legal Defense Fund. The purpose of this fund is to help pay for all of Fauci's legal defenses. And the funny thing about this whole thing with him setting up like a GoFundMe for his legal fees is that Tony Fauci's net worth is $12.6 million. This guy's got $12 million in the bank, and he's sitting here he's begging people for money. And if you ask me, this whole scam of asking his fanatical fans for money is yet another hit on this guy's reputation in public. How ridiculous of a person do you have to be to set up a legal fund like this when you got $12 million in cash sitting in a bank? And if that doesn't tell you how dire his situation is, I don't know what else would. And the thing I talked about when I've been talking about Anthony Fauci ever since he went on in front of Congress and pled the fifth 120 odd times, Tony Fauci is going to be uncomfortable the rest of his life. And that's kind of the silver lining you can take away from this. Tony Fauci is never going to sleep easy again. He's going to have legal battles. I'm sure he's getting death threats. He's getting all of it. This is his fate. Tony Fauci's historical legacy will be that he is one of the most hated men ever in U.S. history. His historical legacy is going to be the idiotic pandemic response and the myriad of failures that sprang out of it. He is the fountainhead of all those failures. And I guess the final visual for most people historically is going to be this broken man pleading the fifth. He's pleading the fifth, and less than 3-4 weeks later, he's setting up a legal GoFundMe defense thing. And it's just so interesting watching this whole thing play out. Like, even 3-4 weeks ago, you didn't have 4 to 5 states going after him legally. He's going to have various civil problems as well. You saw this revelation about miscarriages and all this stuff about pregnant mothers with the vaccine and the booster. His legal woes are going to continue. But I had to laugh looking at this thing. Like, Anthony Fauci Defense GoMe Fund. Like, what planet am I on? And really what you want to ask yourself is, like, who is the low-functioning brainstem that is sliding cash over to this naughty little elf? Again, I take a lot of pleasure in this. This man is going to sit on a bed of nails the rest of his days, and his legacy is toast. And I guess that's just wonderful news at the Foggy Dew. So moving into a second, I promise these were quick hits. You didn't believe me, but you should have. So here's Gavin Newsom. I saw two things that jumped off the page to me. One of them had to deal with Gavin Newsom. But you know what? I'm not going to start with Newsom. What I want to do is I want to start with Mickey Sherrill, because this thing with Mickey Sherrill actually is more germane to what I spoke about the last couple of weeks. So if you don't know the name Mickey Sherrill is the governor of New Jersey. And obviously Mickey Sherrill running New Jersey. Mickey Sherrill's a Democrat. This lady was a naval officer. A naval officer who served as a federal prosecutor. So she's an attorney. And I guess if you look at that resume, it's like anything. You look at that resume, it sounds very impressive. The problem with it is this woman is totally unhinged. She's a nutbag. And here's evidence A of that whole thing. She signed a bill the other day. And I guess if you're just following along with the Democrat national messaging, you would assume that the bill she signed is about affordability, right? Like Mickey Sherrill, the Democrat, because she cares about the people so much, she would be signing some law to save people money. No, that's not what she was doing. The bill that Mickey Sherrill, the Democrat governor of New Jersey, signed involved banning prayer in front of abortion centers. So the governor of a state in the union just signed a bill that banned praying in front of abortion centers. And just to be totally clear, I mentioned it a second ago. This woman is a former federal prosecutor. She is the governor of the state. She is signing a bill outlawing prayer. Again, what planet are we on? First of all, that is a protected constitutional right. That what she just did is obviously unconstitutional. It's not just obviously constitutional, it is on its face unconstitutional. It is an egregious violation of the First Amendment. And the thing about it is, she knows this. Imagine the world that you live in now where a person is a governor who is sworn to uphold your constitutional rights is banning prayer in the public square. It's you can't even fathom it. And again, the question that I have about how does a person ascend to being a federal prosecutor without knowing this basic fact? And the thing you would want to take away from it, it's on its face unconstitutional. This bill is going to get struck down so fast, it's going to make her head spin. And I thought it was interesting because I was kind of looking at Mickey Sherrill and thinking about her. Mickey Sherrill was in Congress at one. Do you know who Mickey Sherrill roomed with when she was in Congress, like when she lived in D.C.? Mickey Sherrill's best friend forever, her BFF, was Abigail Spanberger. Abigail Spanberger is the governor of Virginia who is left of Mao that is an ex-CIA spook. I just think that's so interesting. Like, what were Mickey Sherrill and Abigail Spanberger plotting when they lived together in D.C.? I mean, it's so insane to even think about. And it's so interesting, like, beyond Spanberger, like, here's the other factoid about Mickey Sherrill. Here's Mickey Sherrill, again, Democrat governor of New Jersey, signing a bill banning prayer outside of abortion clinics. That is a very odd position to take, considering she is also a self-described Catholic. So you have a person claiming to be a Catholic signing a bill banning prayer in front of abortion clinics. So a Catholic, an alleged Catholic, just signed a bill like that banning prayer outside of an abortion clinic. Does that even make sense? Like, I'm not sure what branch of Catholicism that these ladies are involved in, but what are we looking at here? You've got Maura Healey signing full-term abortion bills who's a Catholic, and then you got Mickey Sherrill banning prayer outside of an abortion. What is that? What is that? And of course, if you get into the legality of the bill that she signed, every first year, I would think a fifth grade civics kid would know that that's unconstitutional. A first year law student, that should be on its face obvious. That should be in your welcome packet at law school. But how can an alleged Catholic be this obtuse? How is she not excommunicated? It's just a massive fail. It's funny, I mentioned Gavin Newsom at the beginning here because Gavin Newsom is just a walking laugh factory. The train of crazy, Gavin Newsom is the conductor. Gavin Newsom needs no introduction on the Foggy Dew. He just slithers into the conversation occasionally. But here's Gavin Newsom signing an equally ridiculous, unconstitutional bill in the state of California. Gavin Newsom just signed a bill called the, quote, Stop Nick Shirley Act in the law in California. And just to be totally clear, if you don't listen to the fuck, Nick Shirley is the investigative journalist who exposed the Minnesota fraud. Nick Shirley is the kid with a cell phone camera that ended everyone's favorite buffoon's political career, the esteemed Tim Walz. Well, after Minnesota was unearthed, Nick Shirley went out to California. And Nick Shirley has been out in California exposing all the cockroaches that live in California and all the fraud that they're perpetrating. But here you have the governor of the state signing a bill called the Stop Nick Shirley Bill. The kid is sitting here exposing this fraud occurring with all the illegals. He exposed the gravy train. And what this law does is it's criminalizing him from doing that. This law is designed to criminalize investigative journalism into fraud like this. And you're not just criminalizing journalism, you're stymieing investigation into known fraud centers. The state of California has hundreds of millions of dollars in state and federal fraud. And it's just so obvious. Now the politicians don't like the scrutiny because this bill just totally exposes how pathetic they are. Only somebody that is absolutely corrupted to the core would do something like this. Only somebody that is totally guilty would sign a bill like this. And again, the legality of it, this bill is totally unconstitutional. You cannot outlaw journalism and you cannot outlaw honest investigation. And the thing that's so dense about this whole thing, like if my tax money is going into a coffer that Gavin Newsom manages, look, you're taking my tax money under threat of force. I want to know what you're spending it on. But I guess my point with this, as far as a quick hit goes, you have yet another Democrat governor signing a blatantly unconstitutional bill into law in their state. Banning prayer outside of an abortion center and criminalizing investigative journalism. That is just par for the course. And the funny thing about it, it's literally laugh out loud funny. Because the question that you would want to ask yourself when the ink is drying on these bills, like, where's the state attorney general? So you mean to tell me that in New Jersey and California, the attorney general is unaware of these constitutional issues that are brought into the light by the governor signing this? How would a bill like this even pass committee? Every single one of these bills, when it goes through the legislature of a state, has to be examined by like a team of lawyers. And I guess that's, again, the question you really want to ask yourself. So a room full of lawyers, probably Harvard, Yale educated lawyers, they think this is okay? They saw no problem with the constitutionality of doing these two things? That's the thing that really blows your mind when you start peeling the onion back, because if I look at lawyers that think that this is okay, those people should lose their law licenses. They should be disbarred. And I'm going to talk about law schools and lawyers here in the next segment. But it's just unbelievable. How is that even possible? Mickey Sherrill's a lawyer. She's signing this bill. How does she not know that? And I guess my point with this, you can't have a logical debate with somebody that believes in this stuff because it's just so blatant. You can't have a logical discussion because there's no basis of law or understanding to even work off of. And here they are signing this stuff. And guess what? The world just rolls on. The media just kind of ignores it. It's a blurb in a story. Yeah, can you believe they passed this and then it's just going to get tied up in court. And eventually it's going to get rolled back or it's going to escalate to this. It's just a waste of everybody's time. It's blatantly unconstitutional and they're wasting millions of dollars to litigate it. But trust me, I'll be watching that closely. Just madness out of New Jersey and California. So another quick hit that I guess might not be so quick, but I wanted to give an update on one of my favorite topics on the show, and that would be this executive order about securing our elections before the midterms. It's interesting. I've talked about this executive order so many times on the show. I'm not going to go through the mechanics of it, but it's so interesting because you have to watch this executive order because the SAVE Act The SAVE Act is totally performative. The Congress is never going to pass this. But the executive order is working its way through the legal system. And I think I talked about this briefly last week, but Monday of this week, the Supreme Court actually gave an indication of where this is going and how quickly it's picking up steam. And to start, like last week, if you look at the nuts and bolts of this, last week, the United States Postal Service had laid out exactly how they were going to adhere to the executive order. Well, what that's being communicated is that the U.S. Postal Service, they have to prepare for this to pass, and they also have to be prepared for it to not pass. They can't just sit here and not be ready for it. Because if the executive order is upheld by the Supreme Court or whatever court finally makes a final determination, the USPS is going to have to then immediately act on it. Well, I have very good news to citizens of the United States. The Supreme Court ruled on Monday. They ruled 6-3 about this executive order on Monday. And to be clear, totally clear, they did not rule on the executive order's legality. This thing has been caught in this legal crossfire. It's getting stayed by liberal judges, and then it's being allowed to proceed by conservative ones. It's just a bouncing ball, like a pinball of back and forth on left and right. The merits of the case have not been litigated by the Supreme Court, but the path is now clear to this actually landing in front of the Supreme Court. So the 6-3 decision shows you the split here. And of course, it's the three liberals that nuked it. They're total partisans. But this whole thing right now is a parliamentary issue. The reason that this was pushed back, the Supreme Court intervened in this, the legal argument here to dissent was that these people believe that the states can sue without injury. And of course, that's what happened here. Donald Trump filed an executive order. The states sued to stop the executive order. The problem with it is the executive order has not taken effect yet. Nobody has been injured by it because it's not a rule. So they're arguing in a vacuum about, oh, this is unconstitutional, all these other things. Great. Nothing's been litigated yet. You have to allow proper procedure to occur before you can sit there and talk about injury and standing and all these other things. But this whole thing is a parlor trick. Here's Justice Jackson dissenting in this. I thought this was so interesting. Again, this is a procedural vote. A procedural vote. And this is what she says, quote, "This ruling violates well-established precedents concerning the court's equitable discretion and needlessly injects chaos and uncertainty into the upcoming midterm elections. It also lets another shoe drop in the Koska-F nightmare that our precedents have been steadily creating for certain plaintiffs who seek to bring election-related challenges," end quote. That is just an insane screed by this woman. We're not arguing the benefits of the case. We're not arguing the merits of the executive order. We're talking about procedural issues. She's arguing that the procedure is incorrect in a Kafkaesque nightmare. And again, that's the thing to remember here. What occurred is that, again, I'm going to say this again, Trump issued the executive order. The states immediately sued the administration. You can't do that because you don't have standing. And again, my question is, who are the lawyers doing this? They know that you can't do that. You cannot sue without injury. Since no injury has occurred, the states have received no injury. They have no standing. And again, she's making this screed about a procedural issue. But anyway, look, the executive order has not taken effect yet. No injury, no suit. What this does mean, the nuts and bolts of this, is that the executive order is moving forward in the legal system. And it means also that all the lower court rulings have been eliminated. All of the liberal lower court rulings have been eliminated. And the executive order will continue to proceed through its legal challenges. What will happen next is that the Supreme Court is going to issue what they call a final rule. So they're going to sit there and describe the procedural pathway that this needs to go down. So what's going to happen is the Supreme Court is going to publish the new rule, and then this fresh batch of lawsuits is going to drop immediately after. You will have a flood of new lawsuits occur when the final rule is published. And then what will happen is you will see all these injunctions thrown up by liberal judges in lower courts. That's exactly what they do. They're going to reframe it. It's going to be relitigated. The liberal judges are going to put stays on it. And the stays and the injunctions only have one purpose. And that purpose is to run out the clock for the midterms. This executive order, and I've mentioned it many times in the show, is so basic. This creates no new rule. There's no new law being created here. What this executive order is doing, it is merely asking these 20 to 25 non-compliant states to adhere to existing federal law. If these non-compliant states don't hand over their voter rolls, their state results are not going to count. They're in open non-compliance with federal law. So how could any of their results be valid? Now, if you ask me, this whole thing is going to move fast. Trump could fast track this. Yeah, I think he could fast track it by appealing directly to the Supreme Court on this. But to be honest with you, it's playing out nicely. Because what it's doing is everybody's watching this now. Absolutely everybody in the country, liberal, conservative, whoever is watching this. And the funny thing about it is you're getting a really good look at who the cheaters are in our system. Because, of course, when this whole news dropped about the Supreme Court, you had the typical cast of characters coming out on X and stamping their foot and saying, we're going to fight the fascist Donald Trump till the bitter end. Gavin Newsom, Josh Shapiro, J.B. Pritzker. It's all the usual clowns out there honking their noses at this. But you have to look at it just as a pragmatic issue of like, only a cheater would sit there and hide the voter rolls. Well, only a cheater would act this way. And if you're asking me, this executive order is one of the most important things in U.S. politics today. We have about 100 million non-citizens here. We have to secure our elections. And if you look at any polling on this issue about securing elections, this is a bipartisan issue. People are done with this kind of chicanery. And I guess the main question is now, what is the timeline on litigation? Like, is this going to be in effect before November? I mentioned it a minute ago. The final rule is going to go out this week. People like Mark Elias are going to sue immediately. A liberal judge is going to put an immediate stay on this whole thing. Well, what that'll do, it'll elongate the timeline of litigation for about 2-3 weeks. And that's the whole point of the injunctions, is to delay the legal argument here. It's to run out the clock. And if you're asking me, like, is this executive order going to take place before the midterms? I don't know the answer to that because time is short. But what I would argue to you is even if the executive order is not in place, if it's not in place before the midterms, it will be in place for 2028. And that's really what matters. And I don't care what the polls say about the midterms. Democrats in the midterm polls and projections are way overvalued. And if you're asking me about the midterm, and again, the midterms are like a minute away. It's not that long away to November. If you're asking me, I think the Republicans hold the Senate, and I think they increase their majority there. The House itself is going to be a toss-up, but I still think Republicans win. So you could look at the executive order as an acute issue, or you can look at it as more of a long-term play. I look at it more as a long-term play because if this executive order to secure elections is in place before 2028, that's going to make sure that a Republican wins in 2028. And the executive really, in our system of government today, the executive is really what matters. And you can sit there, yes, Congress and the Senate matter, all the things, but the executive is absolutely critical. So assume the executive order holds and we miss the midterms, meaning the executive order goes into effect after the midterms. What that means is that you would have that executive order in place with secure elections for 2028, 2030, and 2032 at a bare minimum. That's a huge win, guys. And I guess the last point that you would want to consider is this, and that would be national security. Voting in national elections is part of national security, which the president has plenary authority over. Trump still has that card. Trump could be sitting there watching the executive order Supreme Court timeline. He could pull the trigger beforehand if he really wanted to. He could declare some kind of national emergency regarding voting. Now, my only comment on that, he could do that. He could declare a national emergency, but politically, that's not a good look, especially with what's going on in Iran and all these other things. That's not going to be a good look. They're going to scream dictator. So Donald Trump, I don't think calling for national security is a good thing, but I think he's better served letting the executive order play out legally. And I guess I'll make one more point about it while I'm thinking about it. The thing that I keep thinking about when I think about this executive order, remember 2020? Remember what the media loved to talk about? That there was like 80, 90 cases that Donald Trump lost regarding the 2020 election. Remember that? There were like 80, 90 cases filed about 2020 being stolen, and Trump lost all of them. And the media's like, well, all these cases and Donald Trump lost all. Zero evidence was ever shown in any one of those trials. They were all dismissed on standing. Every single case was dismissed on standing. Zero evidence was ever presented. And I guess you might be sitting here going, why is he talking about 2020 and why does that matter? Well, think about the timeline here. It's not if, it's when this executive order lands at the Supreme Court, absolutely everybody in the United States of America is going to be watching that litigation. Everybody is going to be following that case. And I guess if you're looking at the merits of the case and this gets in front of the Supreme Court where everybody's watching, the argument could be made at that hearing regarding this executive order about why election security matters. Meaning we're not just having a debate in front of the Supreme Court about the executive order. We could be talking about a full accounting of the national security failures that were evidenced in 2020. Donald Trump could walk up with a treasure trove of information that's not been released to the public and just drop it in the public sphere. He could drop all of this evidence that he claims to have about 2020 right in front of the Supreme Court where everybody's watching. So everybody could be tuning in, looking at this executive order, and all of a sudden you're going to see 2020 in all its glory and why the executive order is needed to secure our elections. That evidence would then be entered into the public sphere, and that would be the coup de grace. And you might sit there and go, well, that's just stupid. We're not going to sit here and talk about 2020. We need to worry about... Look, that scenario is absolutely in play. Donald Trump never got his day in court on 2020. He would have his day in court regarding this executive order. And I can promise you, even if that doesn't happen, even if the 2020 stuff is left aside in the litigation when this executive order gets to the Supreme Court, this executive order is going to get upheld. It's just a matter of when. And if you look beyond that, like the Democrat Party is totally broke. Their message stinks. They're running bad candidates. These people need fraud to be viable. They need fraud to win. It's obvious. The Democrat Party in the last 10 years created a fraud network around voting. They created a whole system of fraud in our voting systems, and it's being exposed and it will be corrected. And again, anybody that sits there and says, well, our voting's secure, our elections are secure, dude, you have hundreds of millions of dollars in fraud in some of these liberal states. And I'm sure you have a lot of fraud in conservative states as well. As long as fraud is evidenced in our financial systems, then there's fraud in our election systems. You cannot expect me to think that we are being bilked for hundreds of millions of dollars in Medicare fraud, but somehow elections are secure. Those things are incongruent. It doesn't make any sense. Anyway, I'll wrap this up. This executive order is the most important thing occurring in U.S. politics right now. By far. Just please watch it because I certainly will be. So switching gears, I talk a lot on the show about COVID, and I promise before I get into this, this is not some COVID or Fauci rant, so please don't turn the show off. But COVID was so fascinating to me. Like, if you look at COVID as like a social science study of human behavior, you would have an ocean of data to study. But a theme seemed to emerge out of this whole thing with COVID. A theme emerged in the school board wars, another facet of COVID that kind of gets overlooked. Like, if you look at the school board wars and you think about COVID, like, broadly it was liberal versus conservative. But the other facet that I don't think gets talked about enough is that it was really science versus law. The liberal side was talking about science and the conservative side was talking about law. And I think that part of it, that component of that argument gets lost. Because the thing about it is, liberals weren't really talking about science, were they? Not at all. Because COVID wasn't about science, it was about political theater, but really what it was about credentials. Scientific credentials versus law and common sense. And the thing that's so funny to me when you look at COVID and you distill it down is the credentialed argument, the expert argument failed. It failed spectacularly. And what I mean by credentialed argument, it'd be like the credentials are the argument, well, the geniuses at the CDC, the FDA, these people, the credentialed class, the expert class, that they say that masks and vaccines work. And the people on the liberal side of the argument here, the masking side of the argument, sat there and said, well, if you have an MD, a PhD behind your name, then all of a sudden that person in a white lab coat is all of a sudden this unassailable authority. Like Dr. Whoever says that 3 masks and boosters work, and Dr. Whoever and whatever is so smart because they went to Harvard, and Dr. Whatever went to Harvard, and therefore they must be right. And you're just some ding-dong that lives in Missouri that has a normal job. It's this idea in the liberal brain that credentials, a degree, somehow imparts wisdom to make these huge decisions. It's this idea that an advanced degree comports intelligence upon the person that has the degree. And the flip side of the argument, if you look at the school board wars, was the legal argument. And if you look at it long term, the legal arguments, the constitutional arguments, the common sense arguments won the debate. Law beat science in COVID. I'm going to say law beat science in COVID. Law and history beat science. But it was so interesting in the heat of COVID to watch science reject law. And I kept thinking about it when COVID was occurring, like my favorite legal fail in COVID was the idea that constitutional rights can be suspended because the government declares an emergency. Like the government, the state, determines that an emergency is so acute that somehow we need to suspend civil rights to address the emergency. In COVID, the government determined that COVID was so deadly that civil rights must be suspended, law must be suspended. That doesn't make any sense because we already have historical, there are historical stories that prove that point wrong. There was a scenario that I kept bringing up in the school board wars. In World War II, Japanese Americans were put in concentration camps by the liberal lion FDR. So you had Japanese Americans that were put into concentration camps. Their civil rights were violated. World War II and domestic security was deemed at that point to be more important than those Japanese American civil rights. The government in World War II decided to suspend Japanese American civil rights because of an emergency that they determined that emergency was worth it. And my question back in COVID was, how did that go for the government? We're still paying off those Japanese Americans now because it is considered one of the biggest violations of civil rights in American history. It's so interesting that fact about Japanese Americans in concentration camps in World War II is so obvious and so well known, but it's just so fascinating to me to watch how quickly the people that adhere to science and the credentialing jettisoned law when it came to it. And it's also interesting, like when you look at it, like to me as a student of law, like it's not even the fact that law was jettisoned. I guess I had a better understanding. Like I thought people in American society, people around me, I thought they had a better functional understanding of how law operates in the United States of America. But I guess the functional understanding of law is not as prevalent as I suspected. People on the liberal side of the argument, by embracing science in that manner, it just showed me that they have zero idea about laws and history. And I guess one culprit of this misinformation on the liberal side could be like grade schools, that they're not teaching civics and law. They're not teaching history. The way law is taught now in like parochial schools, elementary schools, high schools, laws are emotions. And law is pliable to moral imperative. And it's funny because like when I was writing this whole thing, like as a child, I was taught to worship law, to revere it. You study it. The study of law is the study of humanity. It's the thing that separates us from animals. Civilization arose from law. Like if you go back like 5,000 years, if you go back like 5,000 years, in 3000 BC, ancient Egyptians had law. The law that the Egyptians had was ma'at. And that you probably never even heard of that, but that system of Egyptian law was based on impartiality, equality, tradition. I mean, you can go even further than that. Like I'm sure every kid that went through elementary school knows about King Hammurabi. I mean, in like 1800 BC, Hammurabi developed Babylonian law, the Code of Hammurabi. That was written law. It was written into stone. So you have Egypt, you have Babylon. You could even look at things like the Bible. The Old Testament talks about social and moral codes to achieve a functioning society. That's law. And I guess even if you move out of all the examples of law in antiquity, you can look at law in like Greece. Greece and Athens had like no law. They had like no system of laws, but they had this like amalgam of divine law, human decree, tradition. Again, it goes back to tradition. And I guess if you look at it that way from a social science, political science perspective, like Greece, the state of Greece started democracy through implementation of law. And Rome picked up that whole thread there. I mean, as Rome arose, so did law. If you look at Roman law, like back in the Republic, Roman law was super sophisticated. You had this vein of professional lawyers in Rome that grew up in that fertile ground, which was the Roman Republic. Rome had like these detailed rules and laws that were developed. Even those rules, as the Republic became the Roman Empire, those laws were modified to keep up with it. And obviously Rome collapsed. That whole empire fell, and then the Dark Ages emerged. But as humanity even grew out of the Dark Ages, law was rediscovered by Europe. You had like all these medieval scholars that started cataloging laws from Roman history. They cataloged them, they studied them, they refined them. And that effort to study Roman law flowed basically from the Catholic Church. And the church used Roman principles for canon law, religious law. The church used those templates, but that adaptation by the Catholic Church led to a standardization of legal concepts. When you standardize legal concepts, what you're doing is you're creating a manifest common law. Well, when that whole situation occurred, you had legal maxims like truisms, pillars of law were erected at that point. So you look at all these like base components of law that were developed, I mean, literally all the way back from Rome, that were modified in medieval times. And then all of a sudden you had like England just running with all of these concepts. England really exploded law into more of a standardized format. Like you had common law, trial by jury. All the principles and maxims that we use today in law were fashioned and utilized in England. But again, there was a thread of law that existed. And even if you go beyond England, it was the Kingdom of Britain, right? If you go beyond like kingdoms, as monarchies fell and nation states supplanted them, nation states needed law to create their states. You can't have a state created without laws. And if you look at like the United States of America, the United States of America is just a chain in that long story of legal history. And what you have when you look at different nation states, you look at different concepts, different systems. Those different laws create the systems. Laws in Russia and laws in communist states are different than laws in the US. That's how those nation states are defined. Law defines the boundaries of a society. It's a living, breathing part of a country or a state. And I kept saying this in COVID, like, If you have no law, if we're going to ignore law, then we don't have a country. And I think that's the thing that you take away from that. I think that's where the science fanatics made their error. They wanted to set law aside. They wanted to put it aside and say, we're not going to worry about law right now. We're just going to worry about the unassailable science of my position. And the problem with what they did is that discarding of law ultimately ruined their position in our society in a lot of ways. I mentioned it a minute or two ago about I thought there was a higher functional understanding of law in this society, and apparently not, because the lack of legal knowledge was totally laid bare in COVID. And again, you could look at the elementary schools, you could look at high schools. That lack of civics education is obviously a factor in that, but those are easy scapegoats. And it's just so funny to me looking at this paradigm, because if you move away from COVID, but forget about the whole COVID part of this conversation, like what you are seeing right now in US society is a complete breakdown in our legal system. And I just mentioned it a minute ago with this executive order and all the other stuff that's happening with these liberal justices versus conservative justices. This is a perversion of what the founders meant for our legal systems. We have two alternate types of law right now in the United States, two competing ideologies of law. And I think when you look at this stuff, like you have people like Ketanji Brown Jackson that are just like exhibit A of the problem in our society. How is that lady that far wrong and that wrong all the time? She's wrong about everything. I read the screed that she had about this. She doesn't even understand. She doesn't seem to understand like basic tenets of law. And again, she's not alone. You have Kagan and Sotomayor that basically are arguing about procedural issues that are well established. If you're dissenting on a procedural vote, it's totally incoherent legally. And I guess my question is like, I always think about like, where does this come from? Like, where does this perversion of the legal system come from? Because if you look at it, like Justice Jackson went to Harvard. She's not a stupid person. I mean, she has the credentials. And I think that's the problem. It's credentials. That's the problem. It's the same as the white coat scientist credentials in COVID. Credentialing is the issue in our society. Because like in a vacuum, if you said, hey, I'm a lawyer from Harvard, say we're at a barbecue and I start talking to some dude or whatever, and he's like, hey, I'm a lawyer from Harvard. I'd be like, man, you're pretty super smart, huh, guy? If you told me you were a lawyer from Harvard, I'd be like, man, that guy's probably rich, right? Educated, brilliant, East Coast educated. So I guess we've all been like conditioned to think that like this person is a person of high character, high intellect, all the things. But the challenge is the practicality, the reality of that. Like if you think about it this way, like look at a Justice Jackson, Harvard-educated lawyer. Justice Jackson is so intelligent that somehow she struggles to define what a woman is. Justice Jackson is consistently a solo dissented SCOTUS. The Supreme Court, she has incoherent logic in her arguments, bad form, poor decisions. So where does that gap come from? Have you ever spent a minute thinking about like, where does this come from? Like, what is the fountainhead of the problems in our legal system? I'm here to tell you that law schools are the problem. And to be clear, it's not the law schools, it's the whole profession and the practice of credentialing. Like I can sit here and say, well, you know, it's just easy. All these law schools have been subsumed by Marxists. That's an easy thing to say, but the problem with it is it's much deeper than that. It's credentialing. The practice of law and medicine create barriers for entry, and what they do is they demand tribute. So what occurred in the legal profession and the medical profession is that these guys created these like bureaucracies. They created all these independent lawyers, all these independent doctors. They decided to create a massive bureaucracy above their heads. They created boards and committees. Well, over time, all of these layers of bureaucracy that actually had a good purpose when they were initiated, these layers of bureaucracy above the practicing lawyers and doctors have been corrupted by liberal Marxists. And I guess you might be sitting here, what in the world is this guy talking about? He's talking about Babylonian law. Like, what is this all about? I'm here to report that Donald Trump is making a long overdue move in our legal system, and it's a great move by the administration. Trump and the Trump administration is moving to ban the American Bar Association. This is wonderful news. So the Trump administration is not banning the American Bar Association from operating. What they're doing is they're banning them from accreditation. Accreditation is the velvet rope of access into the club. So this is the scenario. So you pick any law school in the United States of America, okay? What happens is those law schools must be accredited by the ABA, which is the American Bar Association. So what happens is that the ABA now is in control of who is credentialed and who isn't, who is accredited and who isn't. So the ABA then can push all this Marxist crap down the throat of the law school. So the ABA could go in and say, hey, do you have DEI policies? Do you have, minority quotas? Do you have woke? Do you have this? Do you believe that laws are emotions? And all of that insanity flows from the Bar Association. Well, great news. Trump is stripping that power away from this liberal Marxist board. This is a massive deal for law in the United States. And I read this quote from the proposal that they're talking about. It's so brilliant. Here's a quote from Trump's thing here. Quote, accreditation in general operates like a cartel. Accreditors feel free to inject their own political preferences, their own ideologies into work that they do, end quote. That's so well said. Accreditation in general operates like a cartel. Put that straight into my veins. The American Bar Association is injecting their own political preferences, their own ideologies into law schools. They're forcing law schools to adopt a curriculum that divorces itself from common sense, history, and law. And it's the same thing as the medical profession. It's the exact same thing as the AMA. But if you look at the practice of law in the United States of America, it's been put in this social chokehold for the last 30 years. The ABA has done nothing but push this insanity downward. And really, it's like anything in society, like law, medicine, our university systems, businesses, our own government. Almost every institution or every business sector has been infected by this paradigm of top-down bureaucracy that's infected by Marxism. And the best way to think about it, they said cartel control. That's exactly what it is. There is a cartel at the top of every industry pushing this insanity downward. And if you look, again, at two of the most critical professions in our society, medical, you have the AMA, and the Bar Association, you have the ABA. Those two associations, those just skim of evil on the top of it, they demand tribute by anybody wanting in their club. And what these things like the AMA and the ABA have done, they're parasites. That's the best way to think about it. The ABA is a parasite on the rule of law in the country. This is a parasitic infection by these organizations. Because the people at the top on the ABA, they call the shots and they demand compliance by the people underneath them. And if you look specifically like medical, this phenomenon of this upper echelon bureaucracy telling its underlings what to do is exactly why you had so few doctors critical of the vaccine or anything in COVID. Doctors were told by the AMA that the vaccine was good, and anybody saying otherwise was some type of heretic to the religion. If a doctor stepped out in COVID and argued against what the AMA was saying, they would be outcasted and stripped of their medical license. Well, if you're being threatened by losing your medical license by just speaking basic facts, you are now a subject. You are not an independent free thinker in your own mind, because compliance is being demanded for you to keep your credentials. And that's really the problem, right? Is that these boards, they demand compliance, and what that does is it stifles debate. Stifling debate hampers innovation and creativity. It squashes dissent. And really what it is, it's no different than any of these woke CEOs or what you see in the WNBA. These are just ideologues captured by their own education. They're captured by their own education and nonsense and fake social pressure. But specific to law, the American Bar Association is a thinly disguised political action group. That's really what it is. In its highest levels, to be fair, are like a cult. They're political animals disguised as a legit board. And great, I think this is a great move by the Trump administration. I hope the AMA gets the same treatment. The AMA should not have this type of power over doctors. First off, they don't deserve it. Did they do anything right in COVID? Of course they didn't. And second of all, if you look at the AMA, it's very obvious that they're politically captive. They have to be. They were doing everything in lockstep with the government. This whole thing about Trump banning this thing I read about in the Wall Street Journal, this is just a couple of stats on this. 80% of the American Bar Association's filings favored a progressive outcome. The ABA took a 100% opposition to the Trump administration. And it's so interesting, like when you go beyond this, like I saw this stat, only 20% of the ABA's filings had anything to do with the legal profession. Then what are they doing? What are they doing? I think it's so great just stripping all their power because the ABA is just like this DEI woke clown car. It is. It's a woke clown car that has a monopoly over law school education and curriculum. If they're able to use their credentialing process to achieve the result that they want, then they need to be shut down. Because really what they're trying to do is make sure that only liberals are being churned out by law schools. And it's obvious. Again, you can just modify the curriculum to put in any kind of insanity you want in the law school. And if they don't do what you want them to do, you strip them of their accreditation. It's a total racket, man. And these schools, man, are not teaching these kids law, history, the things that really need to be taught. They're being indoctrinated. They're being pushed dogma. You go to schools like a law school student, you're being shoved in a bunch of Marxist dogma. Their heads are filled with woke nonsense. There's no critical thinking. So really what happens is law schools are not churning out lawyers. You're not seeing the next James Madison coming out. You're not seeing the next John Adams. Well, what you're seeing is social justice warriors that are just goose-stepping Marxists that are goose-stepping away from their indoctrination centers into courtrooms across the United States of America. They flood the legal system then. And that's precisely how you get people like a Letitia James, an Alvin Bragg, a Ketanji Brown Jackson, a Kamala Harris. It's just like this army of neo-Marxist ideologues that are now practicing lawyers in the legal system. Law schools teach critical race theory. It's like the 1619 Project is like on the docket. Critical race theory, race-based admissions. How do you expect a different result here? But I guess the question is, if anybody's thinking about this logically, like, how does that paradigm create good lawyers? How does it create the next James Madison? How does it create the next John Jay? We're not doing that. So anyway, fabulous news by the Trump administration. I think it's one of his best moves. Strip the ABA. I think it's terrific. And I hope the AMA is next. Cut the Viper's head off. Stop this credentialing charade because it's failing spectacularly. And if you want this country for your kids, you should be excited about this. We have to democratize institutions. We can't have these like loggerhead bureaucracies at the top of all these things, because what this is exactly why our society is floundering. You have these like bureaucracies that are just doing top-down policy changes and they're pushing garbage. It's like a rotten skin of credentialing. Woke gatekeepers. Anyway, great news by the Trump administration. I'm full-throated in support of it. So I had one last story. I'm kind of running out of time. I'd like to keep the show to an hour, but I'll go ahead and kind of tell a quick story that I've been sitting on for a while. And I think anybody that listens to this show knows that I just love obscure military history. And the story that I wrote a while ago was about a guy named Louis Mallette. And who was Louis Mallette? Well, Louis Mallette was born in Maine in 1920. He was like this super patriotic guy. he actually joined the Massachusetts National Guard in high school. Well, after high school, he ended up joining the U.S. Air Force. He trained as a gunner. So this guy in 1941 is sitting like, again, super patriotic dude. He's ready to fight. He sees World War II occurring. Well, by 1941, Millett kind of came to the conclusion. Millett was like, I don't think that the U.S. is going to join World War II. He thought they were going to stay neutral. So he's sitting there thinking that the U.S. is not going to join. So what he did, he actually deserted the U.S. So Millett is sitting here. He deserts the U.S. and he flees into Canada because he wanted to fight. So he flees to Canada and he joins the Canadian Army. Well, the Canadian Army is more than happy to have him. So they say, okay, great. You're enlisted. You're in the Canadian Army. So Millett then was sent to fight in Europe. So this man was actually stationed in England during the Blitz. Well, just a year later, by 1942, the U.S. had joined World War II. So the U.S. is now in World War II, and Millett is still sitting with the Canadian Army. He's like, you know what? I'd like to get into the U.S. Army. So what Millett did is, because he's an American, what he did is he transferred back into the U.S. Army. So now he's with the U.S. Army, and with the U.S. Army, he helped to invade North Africa in a thing called Operation Torch. Well, not only was he involved in the invasion of North Africa, he was also involved in the invasion of Italy. This man, Millett, fought at Salerno. He fought at Anzio. And those were two, I talk about Anzio occasionally on the show, like Salerno and Anzio were two of the deadliest battles in the European theater. But either which way, so here he is in Italy. He's just fought all these like direct engagements. And what happened is that the U.S. Army had figured out that this guy had deserted. So they're like, hey man, you're a deserter. You fled to Canada, fought with Canada, and now you joined us. You're a deserter. So what happened is that Millett was stripped of rank and he was fined. Well, just 2 weeks after, this guy's a total war hero badass. 2 weeks after he was stripped of rank and fined, he was actually promoted to second lieutenant. So here he's promoted to second lieutenant, and Millett actually fought the balance of World War II in Europe. So after the war, Millett then is sent back to Maine. They're done, right? World War II's over. He's sent back home. So he goes back to his quiet life. Well, by 1950, he was actually recalled into active service and he was sent to Korea. So by the time Korea rolled around and when he came back into the Army, Millett was actually in Korea as a captain. So here's Millett. He's in Korea as a captain. He's a World War II veteran. On February 7th, 1951, he was fighting in a thing called Operation Thunderbolt. And what Operation Thunderbolt was, it was a ground assault on a hill. That hill was Hill 180 near Songtan. So it's this American assault on Hill 180 near Songtan. So here's Millett and all of his guys. They're advancing on Hill 180. So as they're going up this hill, what happened is that the platoon that was in front of Millett was pinned down by machine gun fire. So these guys are pinned down by Korean machine gun fire, and Millett's sitting behind them, realizing that these guys could not advance. The fire was too heavy. So what Millett did, he grabbed a second platoon, like another platoon, and he started moving forward. And what he did is he worked his way up and linked up with the pinned down platoon. So think about that now. So now you have two platoons totally pinned down on Hill 180, and Millett's in charge. Well, these guys are kind of at a stalemate now, and they're stuck. So what did Millett do? Millett ordered his men to fix their bayonets. He's sitting there. He tells these guys, these two platoons, fix your bayonets. This is what he yelled. Quote, "You will never get a Purple Heart hiding in a foxhole. Follow me," end quote. So this total badass screams this at his men, and he gets up alone and starts advancing. He's advancing up Hill 180. He's throwing grenades. He's firing at the enemy. And what he did, he actually led those two platoons up that hill in a fixed bayonet charge. A fixed bayonet charge up Hill 180 on the Korean defenders. So his platoons advance under this withering fire. They advance, and and end up at the Korean trenches and actually engage the Koreans in hand-to-hand combat. His men, those 2 platoons, swarmed the Korean defenders. They overran them and forced them to retreat. So Millett, with his 2 platoons and his fixed bayonet charge, gained Hill 180. These guys had killed 50 defenders. 20 of those kills were by bayonet stabs. That Hill 180 then became known as Bayonet Hill. So historians, when they looked at this fixed bayonet charge, they said it was the most complete tactical bayonet charge since the Civil War. The interesting thing about this bayonet charge, it was the last major bayonet charge in U.S. history. It was the last major bayonet charge in U.S. history, and Millett, who led it, won a Medal of Honor for leading that charge. Now, it's interesting, when Millett got back from Korea, he actually attended Ranger School. He wasn't done with the Army. This man actually served after the fact as a Ranger intelligence officer in Vietnam. He actually became a pioneer of Recondo. And if you don't know what Recondo is, Recondo was the teaching of small unit tactics in Vietnam. It's reconnaissance and commando tactics. Because that's really all fighting in Vietnam was, right? You didn't have Napoleonic lines of fighting. But he helped to adapt U.S. military in Vietnam. Well, Millett, in his Medal of Honor, retired from the military in 1973, and he retired at the rank of colonel. This guy lived the rest of his days in California, and he passed away in 2009. But it's interesting, if you look at it, the U.S. Army Infantry Museum at Fort Benning, they actually have a full-size diorama of Millett charging up Hill 180 with a fixed bayonet. But if you look at this guy's career more broadly, he fought in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. He is one of the most highly decorated soldiers ever in U.S. history. But the reason this story about Millett always stood out to me is because bayonet charges are just insane to me to even think about. And I guess it's insane because we have bullets and bombs that fly all this different way. But like, if you think about the history of warfare, like war was always up close with like swords and knives and blunt instruments. Hand-to-hand combat in today's modern warfare, it's just so insane to even think about. But if you're going to fix your bayonets and run uphill in an entrenched position, you're running into the jaws of death. And what a badass quote, too, like, follow me. Yeah, man, I would. But I guess thank you to Louis Millett, just a huge American badass. That's a fixed bayonet charge in 1951. Anyway, I'll go ahead and wrap the show up. If you like the show, please go ahead and tell a friend about it. If you would, please follow us on Spotify. You can also follow us on Instagram at Foggy Dew Daily. If you have questions for the show, please go ahead and email us at foggydew95@gmail.com. But in the meantime, I'd ask you to say a prayer, ask questions, and stay vigilant. This is the Foggy Dew, signing off.